Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Uh, nice to have you again with us. Welcome to this new webinar by the International Energy Agency, still in our energy data and modeling capacity building program for Kenya. I'm very happy to be with you today and to continue our journey on understanding better how to do energy modeling and how to develop long-term plans on energy. So I hope um, everything was clear from the last lecture. I received some questions from some of you, so that gave me, let's say, a grasp of your understanding of the last lecture when we did an introduction on energy modeling. So I hope again you were able to do also the exercise that we provided you. Feel free to write me whenever you have a doubt, whenever some exercises are not clear, maybe in the solutions, etc. So, and also during this lecture, feel free to interrupt me and ask questions, whether it's through the Q&A box or through raising your hand, so that I can leave you the floor and you can ask me directly your question. So after the session we had on Tuesday, today we will look at one side of the energy system, which is end use sector, to try to understand the demand for energy, looking very much into details at what do concretely people want. And we will focus on the building sector. So building means residential plus services and also the industries that clearly use buildings. It's an interesting sectors because it involves all the energies we need. So electricity, we have oil products, we need gas, and also a lot of bioenergy as well, as there are very diverse needs from cooking, for cooking use electricity in appliances, and too many more usages. Just showing you again where we were with it in our overall agenda. So this is number 2 session on energy modeling, and we will be looking at the demand. Next Tuesday, we will discuss power, and on the following Thursday, we will discuss primary fuel, in particular supply with hydrocarbons. In all these lectures, so today, next Tuesday, and also next Thursday, we will be joined by some colleagues of mine, which actually work on these specific sectors, so that you can ask them specific questions that maybe they are the best people to answer to. So as for previous events, just a quick recap. This is, as you know, a virtual class. So any urgent clarification you may need, raise your hand, feel free to ask questions all over the presentation, and we will have one break at the middle when you can address specific, so where we can collect all the questions you have and answer them. Last thing, you have here all emails. So you have Zakia's email, which is my colleague with which you had the statistics part. You have my email for questions focused on the modeling session, on modeling part. And then you have the general email of the Africa program, through which you can also send mail which are not necessarily related to our program, because as you know, our goal is to use this opportunity also to develop whatever parallel process you may think would be relevant, which is linked to the topics we touched during these webinars, but maybe that are more related to your daily work. So whatever, in whatever case you can, we can support us, feel free to put that on the table. As usual, I'd like to start with many questions, just showing you before the agenda for today. So we will set the scene on the building sector globally and in Africa. We will discuss to you a bit activity structure and performances in modeling, which is the specific sector we will look at today. We'll discuss drivers, which are an important item when we do energy modeling, and then we really go through the entire process from understanding future drivers for future trends to estimating useful energy, allocating a portfolio of technology and fuel that can address the needs for services, and then estimating what is the final energy demand at the scale of a country, for example. Okay, so as mentioned, I would like to start with asking you some very quick questions. So I will do real-time polling through the Menti tool. So as usual, you can connect to menti.com, www.menti.com, and I will give you in a few seconds also the code that you can use for today's poll. So just give me a second so that I can share my screen. Okay. Okay, I hope you can see my screen. The code is written here, so I will put it in the chat so that you can directly access it. Again, just to point out, you can do it both from your laptop and from your smartphone if you have it. Okay, thank you. And just a clarification, this is completely anonymous, so feel free to answer freely because we can't access clearly which people answered specific answers. So you can already see the first question for today. In sub-Saharan Africa today, what is the largest fuel used in the residential sector after traditional biomass? This is for today. So we all know that traditional biomass is the largest fuel used today in the residential sector, as I mentioned previously, for many end usages. This question is asking you which is, from your point of view, today the second largest fuel used in the residential sector. So we have electricity, we have oil, we have gas, we have coal, we have modern use of biomass, and we have solar thermal. Clearly, all of them are important, but which is the second one after the traditional biomass? Okay, I see that many of you have answered. The right question, the right answer was electricity. So after traditional traditional biomass, electricity is the second largest fuel used. Specifically, we are talking about the residential sector, which is also the sector we will be focusing on during this presentation. So next question, it's similar, but now we are looking at the future. As you know, our modeling, the goal of our modeling exercises, the vast majority of the time are focusing on tomorrow. So in the future, which fuel do you expect to account for the majority of final demand growth? So you have the same exact fuels that you were proposed, but now we are asking you, what do you think will be the future? Especially, we are talking, again, as just to point out, about sub-Saharan Africa. So which of these fuels do you think will be the most important? Again, we are not talking about traditional biomass, so excluding that, which one will be the most important in terms of usage in the residential sector? Okay, so we have the first person which answered. Okay. So there is no correct or right answer. Some analysts would probably say electricity, others would say other fuels. It really depends on what's the path that the continent will follow. So during today's lecture, we will try to see what are the analyses as at the IEA do, and what are the scenarios that we try to anticipate, and in these scenarios, which are the fuels that account for the majority of final demand growth. So I will go back to the presentation so that we can see what are our answers, let's say, to this question. Okay, perfect. Just one second. Okay, so I'm going back to the presentation. So giving you, the idea is giving you some insights from the IEA data collected on the building sector. So these are historical trends in terms of energy demand as well as CO2 emissions from the building sector. So you can see that the building sector has a very diversified mix of fuels. All the energies are used. We have coal, we have oil, we have gas, but also electricity and bioenergy. So this is the picture globally, and this was the historical data. So we see that energy demand for buildings has been steadily growing over time. You can see that bioenergy, so the green area, has remained stable, whereas other fuels such as electricity have increased much more over the period. Now, what could the future look like? Again, we need to take a scenario approach, and here, considering the steps so that you may know, so you should know right now the stated policy scenario. So the scenario in which the IEA models the announced policies and non-technologies and investment plans. This is where the world would go. So what we would expect is a smooth or linear growth in terms of total energy demand. And when we look at the mix of fuels, we would see that fossil fuels like coal and oil are set to decline. Gas will grow a bit, but the total amount of fossil fuels will be quite the same in 2050. As today, on the contrary, electricity consumption in buildings is set to almost double in the coming 3 decades. So we expect electricity to be the #1 and the fastest growing fuel, so there are also other sources that would also grow as a result of the increase of electricity and relative decrease of coal, oil, and gas. We could see emission flatten. So this yellow line is in the top part of the screen is the emission. So this, as I said, is the result of our modeling exercises using the stated policies, so the stated policy scenario. So, but this was like what, let's say, the countries we are working with stated as policies for 2050, but there is also an alternative, like a different future, which is possible. And this is what it would look like under a sustainable development scenario. If you remember the SDS, so the sustainable development scenario is the second most important scenario performed, modeled by the IEA. And it's a scenario in which universal access to electricity and to clean cooking with climate-driven objectives or aligned with the COP21 Paris Agreement are met. So you can see that the CO2 emissions would sharply decrease, and this is due to a phase out of coal and a strong reduction of oil and gas at the benefit of electricity. What we could also expect, which is very much more energy efficiency, to be able to do more with less energy, less. So these are the prospects at the global level. So this is really important because the implications of these two scenarios, like the results, are really different. and so are the implications at the global level. Now, I would like to show you a bit of projections for Kenya. If you remember, I mentioned you in the very first webinar that during the when we published in 2019 the Africa Energy Outlook, there was a specific section dedicated to Kenya. In this section, and if you remember, you can download it in our website, both in English and also in Swahili language, so that you can also spread it, let's say, across your institutions, also with colleagues that maybe prefer to read it in Swahili. So looking a bit at these projections for Kenya, we had conducted during this outlook. And again, sorry, I remind you that in 2022, we will be publishing a new energy outlook. So, a new Africa energy outlook. And you will see the differences also because this new outlook clearly has takes into account the fact that we had a global pandemic between the two outlooks. So the impact on the overall energy system is relevant, and our analysis also focused on that. So the idea here from this chart is to look at the final energy consumption in Kenya. So here you have all sectors, the residential, but also transport, industry, or productive usage. And you can see that fossil fuels on the left represent a very strong demand or strong share of final energy consumption in Kenya. So the left turn bar, you can see this analysis. Mostly for transport, but it's mostly oil products for vehicles. On the contrary, electricity is a way smaller share, and it's mostly for residential, but also for the industry. And in the future, we can see that there is a growth everywhere, both in the STEP and also in the Africa case. And we have a more than doubling of levels in the stated policy scenario. And if we look at the Africa case, there is even more growth in the final energy demand, which is close to 3 times 2018 levels. And the difference between those two scenarios relates to the fact that in the Africa case, if you remember, like first, everyone has access to electricity and to clean cooking. And in particular, there is a higher GDP. So it would seem like a paradox that we have higher GDP, but lower consumption. But the idea here is that efficiency gains will limit the growth. And for the residential sector, you could see that we expect energy final consumption in the residential sector to, so the green bar, to be mostly met by electricity, but also a bit by fossil fuels, which can be, for example, LPG for cooking or diesel for backup generators. Just 1 second. Okay. Second chart, we can see the projections for Kenya, again, fuels and technologies used for cooking. So on the data we have collected and we are working on with WHO, which is the World Health Organization, we observed that today most people in Kenya are still relying on solid biomass under traditional use. So something which is not considered for sure as clean cooking. By the end of the decade, this number of people would decrease. And we would expect more people to be relying on LPG, as you can see, on improved cookstoves, as well as on other clean energy clean technologies like electricity, like biogas, for example. But if we look at the stated policy, the situation is that, again, we still have many people relying on basic charcoal stoves or traditional uses of biomass. For example, kerosene, mainly kerosene. If we move on the right, we can see that under our Africa case, there is a brighter future, which is possible, in which everyone has access to clean cooking equipments and fuel, again, including clearly biomass, but improved and advanced cookstoves using LPG as well as electricity, biogas, and others. Okay, sorry, I see there are questions. So I have James Lamech, which asked to talk, so I will give you the floor. You should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question, James. Are you able to unmute yourself, James? Yeah, I think there are some maybe issues with connection. No worries, we can go on, and if later you are able, you can unmute yourself after the next step. Otherwise, you can write your question in the Q&A box. Okay. Oh, sorry, I see there is also another question in the Q&A box from Ezequiel Kipiego. Do we expect energy demand to reduce in steps between 2020 and 2050? I don't know if you asked this question before seeing this graph, but as you can see, the final energy consumption clearly, maybe I can use the pointer. Okay. Increases clearly from 2018 to 2040, because in all scenarios we have economic development, let's say all the stated policies, maybe in terms of energy access, they don't try to give access to 100% to electricity to 100% of the population, but still we are talking about high numbers in terms of percentages. So in any case, even in steps, the energy demand is increasing. But what you can see is that from the difference between the steps, so the stated policy scenario and the Africa case, is that there is these demand changes, which is the violet box, which is the higher GDP and access. So this is the increase in final energy consumption, which is due to the fact that the AC, so the Africa case scenario, which is aligned with the, for example, the Africa 2063 vision, envisages an higher GDP and full, like, universal energy access. But we have these efficiency gains, which means that even though the raise would be of kind of like more than 5 mega TOE in terms of electricity, we have a reduction which is due to the fact that the efficiency gains allow Africa, in this case Kenya, to use less electricity, but having, let's say, electricity, but also energy in general, to have the same level of GDP increase, so economic growth, and also access to electricity. I see another raised hand. I hope I answered your question, but David, I don't know your family name, but feel free to, you should be able to unmute yourself right now. Okay.
All right, Elaine, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, my question is on the issue that you've mentioned about the issue of scenario analysis, where
Yeah.
you're saying scenario analysis would be based on, for example, the policy
Yes.
that a country, a government in a certain country may want to follow. But my question is on the side of on your side,
Yeah.
from the database that you have. In the African context, there's a lot of debate around the energy transition towards green energy.
Yeah.
And loading of all these green energy into
green energy,
the grid.
yeah, clean energy, yeah.
But it has its own challenges.
Definitely.
Now, my question is, from the database that you have, are you likely to have someone to do the projections based by, for example, this policy towards transition? Because there are some policies, deliberate policies that have been undertaken to promote going green,
Hmm.
how they are likely to affect the final consumption,
Hmm.
and also be able to decompose that final consumption by energy type. The reason I'm asking this is because I know there are some countries, there are some case scenario that I've seen whereby they are able to have deliberate able to load more of green energy in their grid. For example, a
So,
case of a country like Costa Rica,
hmm.
and be able to manage some of those challenges around the issue of intermittencies and grid stability.
Absolutely.
But and also other countries, for example, Mexico, Brazil, which have taken deliberate effort towards, for example, policy towards market regulations, whereby you have those countries have policies allowed energy deregulated markets in terms of energy auctions,
Yes.
and it has worked for them, and you can be able to see how the final demand is changing, the final consumption is changing. So from the sub-Saharan scenario, are we able to have those kind of analysis based on my question is about the issue of going green, and also as you go green, you decompose that final demand projection for that scenario analysis by the type of energy. Thank you.
Thanks to you, David. Really very important, very pertinent question, and very important topics you raised and you put on the table. Especially the intermittency issue with respect to the renewable energy is clearly one of the main aspects that will be necessary to be taken into account in the future years and decades, because you can't switch on and off the sun, as we all know. So to answer your question, so how this scenario, like the steps scenario, is done? What we do is basically with our analysts collecting, and also like from literature, reading all the documents from all governments all over around the world, to see what are in terms of quantitative and qualitative, what are the policies they stated they will be trying to reach. So what we do, and clearly in doing this, we also interact with all the energy ministries and also other relevant ministries in order to understand each country in 2040, which will be which will be the scenario, like which will be the global energy context based on stated policies from all these countries. So this means that if there are countries which says that in 2040, for example, they will have 80% of the population having access to electricity, or we have other countries that, for example, have policies, stated policies that says that, for example, by 2035, they will have, I don't know, 35%, or in terms of percentage, or in terms of gigawatt of power coming from renewables. So what we do is basically aggregating all this information, all these stated policies, and put them as input in our modeling exercises. On the other hand, the issue that you raised needs a more, let's say, deep analysis, because it really changes. It's really country specific, so it's difficult to have like an analysis which is by region, because each country has its specific peculiarities, especially with respect to the grid reliability. Even now that the renewable energy penetration isn't at the levels that we can, for example, expect or hope for the Africa case. So right now we don't have specific analysis on that. We have general analysis with recommendations. We work with the ministry in order to anticipate what could be these kind of problems we will have. But we are doing this. I can guarantee you that in the next Africa Outlook, which will be published this year, you will see this kind of analysis in terms of what could be the impact, let's say, of a green energy transition in the entire world in general, but especially clearly since we are talking about the Africa Energy Outlook, about the sub-Saharan African region. I can point you also to some documents. So during the next part, I will be gathering some links so that I can share them in the Q&A box. Is it okay? Did I answer your question?
Yeah, all right. That's fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to you. Very, very pertinent question. Okay. Let me check. Okay, no other question in the Q&A box. I don't see any raised hand. Okay, perfect. I will go on with the next part. So just give me 1 second so that I can share my screen.
On this slide, you have the general schematic overview of the World Energy Model. And in this presentation, we will focus on the building sector, which includes the services and residential sector, which are encircled in red on the slide. You can also see the main driver of the related energy service demand. When looking at this overview, we should not forget that an important additional feedback needs to be considered: the impact that electricity and heat prices and fossil fuel prices have on end-use demand in general, and in this particular case, on the energy demand in the building sector. When working on the sector, the first step before doing any modeling is to analyze what do people want. What they want and use are called energy services. In the building sector, it can be space heating, cooling, lighting, cooking, etc. To meet service demand, we need energy, and this energy is consumed by different technologies. In the building sector, it can be air conditioners, light bulbs, radiators, etc. And for each equipment, we also have its associated efficiency. We therefore can distinguish 3 areas: activity, structure, and performance. The activity is linked to the energy services. The structure is linked to the type of equipment present in the building sector, and the performance is linked to the efficiencies of the different technologies. And all of this needs to be depicted in the model. If we look in more details at the structure of the building model, we see that we have different parts that make up the model. The first part includes all the inputs that are needed to do the modeling: historical data regarding energy balances, building stock, equipment sales, and also socioeconomic data like population, electrification rate, or GDP. And we also do some assumptions for the evolution of some of these data, so for instance, population. Some of these inputs will be used to compute energy service demand drivers, like household occupancy, floor area, or appliance ownership. Of course, these drivers will differ for each subsector. Indeed, the drivers are then used to determine the future useful energy demand, or the activity, as mentioned earlier. So for instance, for space heating, we can use the floor area as one of the drivers. In addition to that, we also need a number of historical and future technology data that describe the structure and performance of our system. These data include the efficiencies, the lifetime, the market share of the different technologies. We can then compute for each end use what technologies will meet the service demand, and we will finally estimate the energy demand by subsector and by fuel, as well as the investments and CO2 emissions. If we look in more details at the structure of a building model, we see that we have different parts that make up the model. The first part includes all the inputs that are needed to do the modeling. As we've just seen, we need a lot of data inputs, as data are essential for energy models. Accurate balances are the basis for all modeling work, as we have seen and mentioned in the previous webinars on energy statistics. That's why it's important to build a data repository to organize all the data that you will use for your modeling. As mentioned, the data include energy balances, technologies data with efficiencies, costs, but also policy data that will impact the evolution of this sector. We will explore which are the most important ones in the next slides. As mentioned earlier, one important step of the modeling process is to define energy demand drivers, as they play a key role in describing energy consumption patterns in energy models. Thus, it's crucial to define the best proxy to describe past trends and possible future ones. Before looking in detail at drivers and different methodologies to estimate them, you can see here the general structure for modeling end-use sectors. So first, with the drivers and econometric analysis, we estimate the evolution of the energy service demand, or useful energy. Then, to meet the service demand, we allocate different technologies. And in the case of the world energy model, we use a cost-based approach to do this. Then, with the efficiencies of the different technologies, we can compute the final energy demand. If we go back to the drivers, we will look over the next slides at possible methodologies to identify the best proxy for each subsector. The projections of activity variables can be based on regression with respect to GDP or electrification, but we can also use different types of curves, like the S-curve. And as mentioned earlier, this requires to use different data that can come from the IMF or other national reports.
You've now been introduced to the importance of buildings energy demand modelling and the strong role of bottom-up modelling of energy demand for each end use within the building sector. And then following this, the processes and structure used in the modelling of buildings energy demand in the International Energy Agency. And now I'd like to focus in on one of the most important steps of our modelling process, and that is the definition of the best proxy to then describe the activity variable that can help us understand how service demand evolves for each type of building end use. So again, the proxy is the link that helps us to go from socioeconomic information to activity variables and then to services demand. Now, why do we need this link? Well, firstly, activity variables, we might have this information available for certain countries in the historical period, but we don't have it available for all countries over all of the time series, and we definitely don't have this information available for the projections. So therefore, it's up to us to take the information that we do have, and that is socio-economic information, and to use this information and these assumptions for the future to calculate our own activity variables. Once we've calculated these activity variables, we can use them in our projections to understand how service demand evolves, and then based on what technologies we choose, how energy demand evolves in our projections. Now, there are several types of activity variables that are of interest to us. Certainly in the building sector, one of the most important activity variables is household occupancy. So this is how many people live in each household on average. Now, household occupancy can help us to understand energy demand for end uses such as cooking or water heating, for example. Now, because we do not have information on household occupancy into the future, It's up to us to try and define a relationship between a variable that we do have information in the future and this household occupancy variable. So here we've chosen to plot values of household income against household occupancy. So we've taken all the data on household occupancy that we do have for historical periods for different countries, and we've put them on this chart against the GNI per capita, which is in itself an indicator of household income or of personal income. And what we can see is we have an inverse curve that's being drawn here. So that means that as we increase the average income per capita or per household, then we are decreasing the number of people per household. So here we're seeing a strong relationship between GNI per capita, so gross national income per capita, and a decreasing number of people per household. So we have on the right an inverse curve equation that can be used to define this relationship, and then can be very interesting for us and is a key step in our modeling to be able to say in the future, if from our external assumptions, which for us come from organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and our own assessment and projections of economic growth and population, we then use these assumptions on economic variables to understand via this equation how household occupancy evolves in time. So that's just one example of this process of identifying a proxy that has a good relationship with the variable that interests us and using this proxy to describe the activity variable. So here, household occupancy. Now, another example of a relationship of interest to us in the buildings energy demand modeling area is ownership variables. And so how does the ownership of a given appliance, such as a refrigerator in this example, evolve in time based on another variable? So here we've plotted ownership of refrigerators for all the countries for which we have data and over all the years for which we have data. And we've plotted that against here where we have a discriminant criterion, but we can very easily say that we can plot this against GNI per capita or even GDP per capita. So the most important variable to have on the x-axis is income in this case. And if we build this chart and fill out the data, we can very clearly see that there is an S-curve relationship between refrigeration ownership, so the average number of refrigerators per household, and the average income. And so that means that with time, as income increases, then we get to a point where the number of refrigerators on average per household starts to really increase. And then as we get to a point where households are increasingly rich, then the growth in refrigerator ownership slows down. Because once we get to a point where we already have at least one refrigerator on average per household, then obviously there's less need to increase and to continue to purchase additional refrigerators. So there is a saturation point, and that's why S-curves are so important, because they show us at the start that we might not have enough income even to think about buying a refrigerator, but at a certain point we start to cross that threshold and a refrigerator becomes a desirable and useful purchase and use of income. So we see that growth, that increase in the rate of growth of the S-curve, and then it flattens out as we start to saturate. So the S-curve is a very important indicator for understanding the relationship between many economic variables and the activity variables that interest us for buildings energy demand modeling. And I'll get to a description of the discriminant criterion and how we can draw upon several economic variables to influence and describe this curve in just a minute. But firstly, I would like to go through an example of air conditioning ownership. So here we've done the same thing as in the previous figure. We've plotted on the left-hand side, on the y-axis, the average ownership of air conditioners, and on the x-axis, the average income per capita. So we've used all the data points that we have in our database, and we can see that it's a big cloud of points without a very strong relationship. So here it's difficult to imagine an S-curve describing the evolution of air conditioner ownership with income. But when we bring an additional piece of information to the picture, we start to see much clearer relationships. So now we start to plot data points, so air conditioner ownership and income, depending on the need for cooling in that region. So here the need for cooling is described in terms of annual cooling degree days. So a cooling degree day is a variable that can be calculated based on the threshold temperature in a given country and the average daily temperatures within that country. So here we can clearly see that for countries in darkest red, so the countries with the greatest cooling demand need, there is a relatively strong view of an S-curve that evolves in time. So we can see that as in those countries incomes start to increase, the rate of air conditioner ownership rapidly increases and moves towards 1, so an average of 1 air conditioner per household. However, if we look at countries in blue, so with very low cooling needs, then we can see that even when incomes, average per capita incomes increase to very high levels, the air conditioner ownership stays quite low, because obviously these households, despite their high incomes, are prioritizing purchases in other needs because their cooling needs are not very high and not very pressing. So the message here is that sometimes we might have just the economic variables, so GDP per capita, and some information on ownership, but that's not enough to define a clear trend and a clear curve that can be useful for us. So sometimes we need to bring additional data to the table to help us understand the evolution and the relationship between the economic variable and the activity variable that interests us. Now, before going on, I'd just like to summarize some of the key end uses that we model in a bottom-up fashion in our buildings energy demand modeling, and the activity variables that we use to describe the energy service demand for that end use. And then further on, the proxy that we use, so the economic variable that is a key variable for us to help to understand the relationship between evolving economic conditions and the activity variable. And then finally on the right, the type of curve and the type of equation that we use to connect the proxy with the activity variable. So firstly, with cooking, the first curve that we saw was an inverse curve. And so for cooking, we use people per household to help us understand the evolution of service demand. So people per household is our activity variable. And as with all end uses in buildings, we're using GNI per capita, or you can use GDP per capita as well, as the most important proxy to help us describe the evolution of the activity variable. So we take our projection of GNI per capita that comes from other assumptions. So again, it might be World Bank, IMF. For population, it might be the United Nations. And then we use this variable via the curve, so the inverse curve in this case for cooking, to describe people per household and understand the evolution of people per household in time. For lighting, we use an S-curve because the activity variable is floor space per household. And with an S-curve, that describes the fact that as households become more rich, so does the floor space of those households increase, and then we get to a point where there's saturation, and so the S-curve starts to flatten out. For water heating, it's again a question of describing energy service demand by the number of people that live in the household, because if we think that each person in the household may take 1 shower per day, therefore the energy demand need for water heating is dependent on the number of people in the household. So here, again, we're using an inverse curve, the same as for cooking. But then if we look at air conditioning, so cooling and appliances, then it's a question of ownership. How many air conditioners or how many refrigerators, televisions are owned on average by the household? And then how does this ownership evolve based on increasing income? So again, an S-curve, rapidly increasing at a certain point and then starting to slow down as ownership saturates. Now, just a note here on cooling, we could also say that floor space per household is an important variable, because if we're trying to cool a much larger household with 1 air conditioner, then we're going to be having a higher energy service demand. So we can certainly look at both variables, firstly the ownership rate, and then also if we have an increasing number of meters squared per household, that will also increase the floor space, the energy service demand, sorry. So in cases like this, we can look at having two activity variables that both combined can help us to understand the evolution of energy service demand. Now, to move on, I wanted to come back to the fact that sometimes we want to bring in additional variables to help us describe the trends. So if we look on the left-hand figure, the x-axis here is just GNI per capita. So it's an income proxy, essentially. So we're taking our income variable and we're using this to describe the number of units per household. But we can see that the curve is quite cramped. It's really not an easily defined S-curve. And that's because in the first, let's say, $5,000 of GNI per capita, there's a huge amount of people that suddenly buy refrigerators. And it's all happening very rapidly, and perhaps economic variables such as GNI per capita are not the perfect variable to understand what's happening in this first part of the curve. But now if we turn to the right-hand side figure, then we can we use here a discriminant criterion. So this is basically saying it's a variable without a unit, which is just an indicator that combines several proxies. So it's combining GNI per capita, so it's taking the economic variable, but we're also bringing in information on the electrification rate within the country and the urbanization rate. Because when we start plotting this data, we clearly see that not only does the economic variable influence ownership, but so does electrification rate and urbanization. Because obviously we're not going to buy a refrigerator if we do not have access to electricity. So despite the fact that we might have an income, if without electricity, there's no point buying a refrigerator. So this is, it seems evident, but obviously it becomes very important when we start translating it into these curves, and we can see this flat period at the beginning for those that still don't have access to electricity, despite the fact that they might have an income. And likewise, the data shows that with higher levels of urbanization, we also have higher levels of refrigeration. And so we bring in these three different variables that describe so an energy access trend, an economic trend, and a geographical trend, and bring that information together to build this discriminant criterion, which then helps us to get a much more clearly defined S-curve, which is then more useful in understanding in the future with a given a value for energy access, for income, and for urbanization, what might we expect in terms of ownership. So this is multivariate analysis and multivariate regression, as opposed to the earlier examples which were shown, which were using a single variable, so GDP per capita in those instances. Okay, now let's run through the principles of multivariate analysis for using many or several economic variables, population variables, or other interesting variables for which we have information to describe the evolution of activity variables. So the first point here is to look at the data that we do have. So taking the data we have on, say, if we're interested in refrigeration ownership, looking at the available data on refrigeration ownership, selecting a set of these data points which seem like a good, clean trend, and then trying to match these data points with available variable data on, say, GNI per capita, GNI per, or GNI absolute values, electrification rates, weather data perhaps, or any other variables that might be available. And then what we can do is plot all these variables together on a chart. And so, for instance, we'll have our variables on the y-axis on refrigeration ownership, and then we'll be plotting that on the x-axis against lots of different variables again and again to try and understand, is there a relationship between that variable refrigeration ownership and the variable that we're putting on the x-axis. And so what we can do, what we achieve by doing this, is we identify the most important variables that seem to have some sort of relationship between this variable and refrigeration ownership. And then we can partition the data into similarities, or based on what the data is actually describing. So for instance, if I take GDP per capita or GNI per capita, they're very similar data points. And so within this multivariate process, there's no point having data points that overlap and describe very similar trends. So even though both GNI per capita and GDP per capita are very useful variables that can both be used to describe the evolution of my activity variable, I'm not going to put them both into this multivariate analysis because they are describing the same things. However, if we look at a variable such as electricity access, then that is removed from GDP per capita and describing a different set of trends, and therefore we would put that in another class, and it would be very useful then to have variables from different classes, for instance 2 or 3 variables from 2 or 3 different classes, and bring these together to then feed into to establish the best combination of these descriptive variables that can be used to describe our activity variable. So once we have the 3 or the 2 variables that we've chosen, then we want to use a certain type of multivariate regression to understand what the best combination of these variables is to best describe this activity variable trend. So for us, we use canonical variate analysis. And so that's something that that you can look up and try and understand the processes involved, or there's many other multivariate regression techniques that can be used to combine several variables to deliver one discriminant criteria, so one variable that combines all this information and then can be used for us to plot and understand the evolution of the activity variable. So that's then step 5. Once we have this relationship defined, then we can use our projections of, say, electricity access rates, of urbanization, of GDP per capita, feed all this information in, calculate our discriminant criteria, then take the discriminant criteria, put it into our curve equation, so our S-curve equation in this case, and then that will give us a forecast of the ownership of the activity variable. Now, the final point I want to make before I pass on again here is what we do with tracking data and how do we project the variables that interest us when we do not have the available historical data. So just take a step back. The first thing we do is we bring all the data that we do have together for all the countries that interest us. And then what we'll do, we'll divide the countries into different classes based on the type of, I guess, the category of the country. And so, for instance, we would bring countries together that have similar economic contexts, that have similar climatic and population growth contexts. So here on the left, we can see we've put countries, so country A, B, and C into different classes. And so we have several different classes for countries across the world. But for instance, if you're looking just at the African region, it might be pertinent just to have one class and to not bother about defining different classes. Now, once we've done that classification by class, then we need to look at the data availability for each country within each class. So for instance, if we take the example of country A, then country A is a country that is well informed in terms of data. So we have historical data available for many years for the activity variable that interests us. So it could be household occupancy, it could be refrigeration ownership rates, it could be floor area per average household. So here we have the information we need historically to be able to build the curve and build a robust equation that then can be used for the projections. However, for many countries, this unfortunately isn't the case. We do not have this data available. So for many countries, we find ourselves in the position of country B. So that means we're poorly informed. We might only have a couple of data points. So there might be a data point from a survey that's taken place only once, or maybe 5 years ago and 10 years before that. And so that means that we don't have sufficient data available to build a robust and reliable curve, so an S-curve equation, for example, and then to be able to use this S-curve equation to project activity variables into the future. And so what we do in this case is we use the curve that was described by all the countries for which we do have data. So we take the average curve of all the countries in class 3. So for instance, if we put all the data for ownership of refrigerators for countries in class 3 together in one figure. And then we use that to describe, to build an S-curve. And we have the equation for that S-curve. We can then use that S-curve equation for all countries that find themselves in the position of country B. But we shouldn't forget that for country B, we do have 1 or 2 data points. So what we'll do is we'll then shift the curve up or down to make sure that the curve is running through the most recent historical data point that we have available. So that's a way of ensuring that for us, we can use these curves to describe the trends for the 1 or 2 data points we do have, and to backfill the missing historical data, as well as understanding how these activity variables will evolve in the future. The final situation is the situation of country C. So this is a country for which we have no data at all for activity variables for the end use that interests us. So in this case, we have no other options. All we can do is take the average curve of class 3, so the average of all the countries within this class. And so that means country C will just be described by the average throughout, because we don't have any data points to be able to shift and run through those data points. And so we go straight through to the projections of the activity variables using obviously the economic variables that are specific to country C, but using the S-curve or the inverse curve equation, that is the average of all the countries in class 3. So this is a very important point on how to find the data, and then what to do with the data, and what to do, very importantly, when we don't have the data, all the data that we need to build these curves, and therefore to project the activity variables. And just a point to note on data, so obviously there's many different sources available for countries across the world, but in many African countries it can be quite difficult to find this sort of data. So at the International Energy Agency, we've often looked to surveys such as the surveys conducted by USAID, and we can find these surveys online, the DHS surveys, and often there is information within those surveys that can be used to help us in this modelling process. Alternatively, there can be specific literature on a specific country based on surveys conducted within that country, or based on academic work. But basically, the first step certainly is to look for the data that does exist for the end users that interest us most, and to contact or reach out to as many people as you can to try and get the best data and ensure that you start with the strongest foundation.
Okay, perfect. This was the first part of this presentation from our colleagues. What you have seen in this part was the fundamentals on energy modeling, the activity structure and performance in modeling the building sector, and then the drivers, this last part, the drivers of the energy demand in the building sector. Then we will see the last two parts. But before that, first, I wanted to answer the question from Ezequiel Kipiego, which pointed out that his question was referred to the another slide with respect to the one I used to answer. So I will go back, and this question in the Q&A box is that, do we expect energy demand to reduce in steps between 2020 and 2050? So this slide I'm showing you is the Africa case. So the sustainable, my bad. The sustainable development scenario, because in this case we are talking about the whole country. So here you can see how the energy demand and also the CO2 emissions in the end use sectors are decreasing. This is because in the sustainable development scenario, there is like the model goes through a path to decarbonization. On the other hand, let me go back to the previous slide. Here you have the stated policy scenario, and in this case you can see how the energy demand and also the CO2 emissions increase by 30% in the case of the energy demand. So we move from more or less 3,000 mega TOE in 2018 to 4,000 mega TOE in 2050 in this stated policy scenario. On the other hand, if you remember what I told you, the emission will flatten because we have the total share of oil and gas, which is almost constant. We have a decrease in oil and coal, which is substituted by the gas. But on the other hand, we have electricity, which is increasing. This is because a lot of countries in their stated policies have a path to decarbonization. So pay attention in the differences between these two scenarios because they are really important. I hope I answered your question, Ezequiel. Otherwise, feel free to or raise your hand. I can give you the floor. Otherwise, also to answer again in the Q&A box. So I will go back to our agenda, and I would like to have a second round of polling exercise. So I will share again my screen. You should be able to see the Menti. I will ask you to. Okay, thank you, Ezequiel. Apparently, I answered your question. Thank you very much. So we will do a second, other two questions from the Menti using the Menti tool. So I invite you to connect to the link, which is already in the chat. You also have the code. I can pass also the code, so it's easier for you. Okay, so the next question is, if we have the energy consumption of an AC unit, what is the most important parameter to estimate total demand? So here you have the floor space, so a meter squared. You have the number of households, and you have the number of units per household. So answer again, I remind you that you can do it from your laptop, from your telephone, and it's completely anonymous, so I can see who answered what. Okay, I see 4 people answered. Okay, I see. Yeah, 7 people answered. You can continue, but to answer, we have kind of ex aequo, just floor space, which is a bit has one more vote than the other two. Actually, there is no good or right answer in this case. What's for sure is that in our reasoning and our approach, we can indeed think at the household level, looking for one average household, for example, how many units we have in this household. We know, because this is the question, how much energy one unit will consume. And then, of course, we will multiply this value by the number of households in the country to get the number at the country level. So floor space also can be an interesting proxy, because clearly the more space you have, the more AC unit energy, the more energy the AC units will need. Okay, sorry. Okay. So yeah, we have, if people live in a very small house, clearly one AC unit or one fan will be sufficient. The needs for cooling, on the contrary, if people live in a very wide space, they might need more than one AC unit. But it can also be a question of income. How many equipment can people afford? And then it might be about also other indicators. So feel free also to propose if you have in mind other indicators that could be used in order to do this exercise. Next question. If we have the energy consumption of a water heater of a household, what is the most important parameter to estimate total demand? So you can answer again. You can think that we have like multiplier factors, like the number of household. We have the floor space, which I don't know if you think would be useful. We have the household occupancy, so how many people there are in the average household in this country. That could be Kenya, for instance. I see that the vast majority of you are answering the number of the household occupancy. So yeah, okay, the correct answer was the household occupancy, because you can use that in order to assess the energy consumption of one specific household, because the more people there are in the average household, the more water heater, so the more energy the water heaters will consume. But on the other hand, since we are looking at the country level, once you have done your analysis on the average household, you can multiply that by the number of households that there are in the entire country, which again is a number that can come from, for example, the demographic, statistics agencies which are in charge of demographic analysis and collecting statistics across the entire country, for example, for instance, Kenya. So thank you. This was the last question for today. I will go back to the presentation, but just for a few seconds, if you have a question. So we go back to a few minutes of Q&A session, and then we can go back to the lecture with my colleagues Ariane and team. Any question? Feel free to raise your hand or write in the Q&A box. I don't see any questions, so I can move on, but feel free to answer, to put your questions. And in the next phase, in a few minutes, we will have another Q&A session, and also my colleagues will be joining us.
Once we have determined past and projected activity variables and service demand intensity, the total energy service demand, or useful energy, can be computed. For this, we can rely on end-use intensity, which is derived from our projections of activity drivers, as well as other data coming from our database, like the historic energy demand by fuel and end users, historic and projected temperatures. So we usually use heating degree days and cooling degree days, or historical technology market share and efficiency. For instance, with all this information, we can compute the energy intensity per square meter for space heating. Once obtained the total projected service demand, we can now reflect on which technologies will meet the demand. So for each year of the projection, we can compute the total energy service demand that needs to be satisfied by new equipment, by accounting for new incremental demand and considering the retirement of existing technologies. So of course, in later years of the projection, we also have to take into account the retirement of technologies that were added by our model. So how do we do this? For this, we need to have a detailed stock accounting. So with the historical market shares and efficiencies, we can compute the stock of existing technologies. And with the lifetime, we can determine the remaining stock for each year of our projection. And finally, we can compute the service demand to be met with new sales. So the sales of new equipment need therefore to replace previous equipment and to meet new demand for energy services. So you can see that the lifetime of equipment and its age distribution can play an important role in the capability of the system to renew the overall technology stock. In countries with burgeoning energy demand, such as in developing countries, the share of replacing old infrastructure and technologies is more limited, while its weight is more important in advanced economies. Now we have to determine which technologies will meet the service demand. The technology and fuel choice depends on a variety of elements, and first of all on the available technologies for each subsector in each market considered. That's why we have an important database with all technologies available in each subsector. So for instance, you can look at the cooling subsector and you can see the different types of air conditioner that are in the model. The choice of technology depends on various parameters. The available potential of renewable resources can play a very important role, as well as several energy policies such as energy efficiency standards. In the World Energy Model, we rely mainly on a cost-based approach to determine which technologies will be installed. For this, we need to compute the cost associated to each technology, which includes the investment cost as well as the operation cost. For instance, for an air conditioner, we must take into account the price of this AC, but also the price of electricity that will be consumed by this technology. In our model, we assume that the technology share will be proportional to 1 divided by the specific cost of this technology. This least cost approach is often the most used criterion to select the technologies, but it's also important to consider boundaries to reflect market failures, behavioral patterns, and energy policies. For instance, we can set a minimum target for heat pump to be installed if we consider that energy policies are pushing the development. Here you have an example of the projections we made for various lighting technologies. On the left, you have the evolution of efficiencies, and on the right, the evolution of the market share of the LED. So with this information, we'll be able to compute the main outputs of the model. So you can see that estimates of historical efficiencies and performances of equipment and possible future evolutions are key parameters to make reliable estimates. That's why technology partnership, sharing information, and continuous interaction with the energy industry are really crucial elements to achieve it. As said before, once the technology choice is determined for each subsector or each projection year, together with the market share, efficiency, and fuel of use, the final energy demand can be computed, as well as the related CO2 emissions and the investments that are needed for new equipment additions.
In the last part of this building's energy demand modelling session, I would like to provide several examples of the results of our modelling, specifically the results of our modelling applied to the Africa context, and use these results to reinforce the importance of efficiency gains and understanding the impacts of improving efficiency and changing technologies on energy demand. So these are some of the results that we can then communicate to policymakers to reinforce certain messages and the importance of taking steps and putting in place policies to achieve energy objectives. So here we've taken an example from the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook Special Report on Africa, published in 2019. So looking at electricity demand from household appliances in the year 2040 under two different scenarios. Now, if we look at the left part of the figure, we can see that under a scenario where the current and announced policies are enacted and economic growth follows an expected trajectory as announced by the International Monetary Fund, then we can see electricity demand across Africa for these uses, for residential uses, increasing to around 350 or close to 400 terawatt hours. However, if we pass to a scenario where economic growth in Africa is much more rapid, so economic growth is in line with the expectations for African countries, and we also have energy access, so universal access to electricity and to clean cooking, which is achieved by 2030, so in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, then we see a much more rapid growth in energy service demand. So obviously, if we come back to the activity variable story in the bottom-up modelling process, then higher economic activity means higher average household incomes. This then translates to greater floor area on average per household, much higher household ownership of appliances such as refrigerators, televisions, washing machines, and higher household ownership of cooling equipment such as air conditioners. So if we just added to the system the same equipment that was being used in the step scenario, then we would have a huge increase in electricity demand. So going from around 350 terawatt hours to over 1,000 terawatt hours. So this obviously has very important implications for power systems and for the costs needed to increase generation capacity, increase transmission capacity, and then for energy bills, electricity bills for consumers. But what we want to show here is that by improving the efficiency of the appliances that are added, we can drastically reduce the impact of all these additional appliances. So that means that we can have a big increase in demand for energy services and so in quality of life because people have more appliances, but we've limited the impact on the energy system. So that's through greater efficiency. And so if we look at the right-hand side of the figure, we can see that the very important differences in the ownership variables for different types of appliances averaged across Africa. So we can see that we have significant growth already in the steps, especially in appliances such as televisions and refrigerators, but also in air conditioners, although they do remain at a much lower base. However, if we look at the Africa case, then this growth in ownership really does explode. So obviously this is important. It's people getting access to services, but via the modeling, we understand that as we put in place more efficient technologies, so thanks to policies, then we can limit the impact on energy systems of this increase in energy demand, energy service demand. So to be able to do this sort of analysis, we also need to have the modeling in place, but we need to understand what policies are in place today and what are the efficiencies of existing equipment and equipment being sold. For instance, we'll need to know how efficient are the air conditioners being sold today and what policies are in place that would impact the efficiency of these air conditioners. So that provides us with a baseline, and we can also look at how the policies and the policy change over the last years has impacted the energy intensity of these end users. So here is just an example where both heating and cooling policies have been tracked, and we can look at the building stock and the useful energy demand in terms of understanding which part of that energy demand is covered by policies or not covered by policies. And then based on that, we can understand how stringent is the average coverage across the building stock. And so what we want to see is that the stringency improvement really brings down the energy intensity of meeting demand for services such as cooling and heating. And if we take the example of water heating, then here we're looking at the evolution of energy demand in 3 different scenarios. So the first scenario, the RTS, is a scenario similar to STEP. So here we're just looking at the policies that are in place and the policies that have been announced, whereas the 2 scenarios to the right are more ambitious scenarios that meet climate objectives. So a 2-degree scenario and a below 2-degree scenario. So what we see here is just pure outputs of our model when we impose the constraints of saying we need to reduce emissions in line with a certain scenario, so 2 degrees or beyond 2 degrees. Then that means we need to see a big change in the fuel mix. And so this is obviously bottom up. It's coming from us saying we need to allocate a renewable technology as opposed to a fossil fuel fired technology. And these are the evolutions of the energy mix that then result. So it's these kind of results that can provide a visual communication of what the modeling is doing and then help us to bring together key messages and key numbers to communicate to the policymakers who can then act on the information coming from the model. And one final slide here is very specific to Africa and specific to cooling to again underline the importance of increasing efficiency. So Africa's cooling needs, as many of us know, are much higher than most other places in the rest of the world. Many locations across Africa have cooling needs that are an order of magnitude higher than in countries such as France or Italy. And these cooling needs also dwarf major cooling demand centers of China and the United States today. And we see that almost 700 million Africans today live in areas where the average daily temperature exceeds 25 degrees. And average temperatures are often 1 to 2 degrees higher again in cities. And as Africa's population increasingly urbanizes, cooling needs will further grow. By 2040, the number of Africans living in hot areas approaches 1.2 billion people. As populations expand, especially in cities, and average temperatures increase with climate change. High cooling needs today and higher cooling needs tomorrow contrast with some of the lowest levels of air conditioner ownership in any region, averaging today only 6 units, so 6 air conditioners on average per 100 households. Now, obviously, wealthier countries across the continent, such as Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, have higher ownership rates that can be up to 3 times the average of the African continent itself, while less affluent countries with often much higher cooling needs have ownership levels that are only half the African average or less. So as a consequence of this low average ownership of cooling needs, electricity demand for cooling today is very, very low in Africa. But the potential for future growth is strong. Ownership of cooling devices sees an important increase in our Africa case in response to these higher average incomes I described earlier and rates of access to electricity. So we reach in 2040 an average of 25 units per 100 households, but this is still well below the global average today. Ownership of fans increases further, but fans obviously have a lesser impact on electricity demand. So if we focus on electricity demand from air conditioners, then we can see that electricity demand in the residential sector across Africa for this end use could grow to well over 200 terawatt hours by 2040. So that is just a huge increase in demand that would have major implications for power systems, especially because of the fact that air conditioning electricity demand is often concentrated in certain hours of the day, so difficult to manage. But the importance here is to use the building energy demand modeling to understand that if we change the efficiency of these air conditioners, then we have the potential to cut this future growth in half. So we can reduce costs for the power system, reduce costs for the consumer, and reduce emissions. So here, this is again the messaging using the model to understand if we change certain variables, such as putting in place a policy which improves air conditioner efficiency, what are the results that we could expect?
Okay, so we are back. Now, I will move to the next phase, which is the exercise. Okay, so you should be able to see the exercise of today, the modeling exercise for today. Okay, can you see it? Yeah, I think so. Okay, so you've seen again some of the findings from this modeling work, especially on cooling, and that gives a good transition with the Excel exercise that we have proposed you on this topic. So I hope you could have the opportunity to look at the Excel exercise, to try to make the calculations yourself, or even to look at the answers. I will share you my screen now, as you can see, so that we can go through a bit of the questions and try to go through the reasoning which is involved in this case. So you have been asked. So this is page 63 of our handbook that you can see. You can find in the Google Drive repository. And the exercise is about energy demands in building, clearly. You have been asked to estimate the future demand for electricity meeting cooling needs in the building sector. As the Ministry of Energy of this hypothetical country, that could be clearly Kenya, wants to anticipate future electricity demand from buildings and to develop energy efficiency policies. You receive this simplified model to help you with this task. So you have this model in which you have as the for the last lecture, the previous lecture, this historical data in the orange, the columns colored in orange, and then you have a projections part of the Excel, which for some specific drivers is already filled, because you have the GDP per capita, which has, for example, been shared with you by institutions working on economics and on finance, which did the projections from 2019, for example, to 2030. And you have also the population projections. For example, you can have your statistics agency, which did the projection for example, Kenya population from now to 2030. Then you have other drivers like the number of households in million. You have the number of AC units right now, like the historical data in the last 2 decades. And you have the service demand intensity, which is the kilowatt hour per service for service per appliance. And you have the electricity demand in terawatt hour for the entire country. To estimate future energy demand, we will follow the steps which were presented by my colleagues, and that apply to all end uses in all sectors. So we will deal with the building sector, but you can replicate this kind of approach also for other end uses in all sectors you can be working with. We will look at drivers of demand of energy services and project how they could evolve in the future. We will try to estimate the future services required. We will also allocate a portfolio of technologies that can eventually meet these services because clearly all technologies have different, for example, efficiency rates. And at the end, we will try to evaluate the final energy demand, which in our case is the total electricity needed to meet the total service demanded for cooling in this country. So this is summarized in this flow chart, in which you can see how, starting from drivers, we will try to reach the final energy demand for the entire country. Please, again, as for the previous exercise, note that we made several simplifications just for the sake of simplicity in this case. So just try to start with this exercise, which is an example, and then you can try to also complicate the model and move with more structured and more detailed analysis. But I think that this exercise, at least compared to the one we did in the previous lecture, is a bit more structured, and you will see. I don't know if some of you already managed to do it by themselves. Please tell me if there are any issues with the sharing of the screen or whatever. So the simplifications are: we will only consider households in the entire building sector. Clearly, we have also residential, so that comprise residential and services. There are several technologies clearly providing cooling services. We will take the assumption on the prevalence of each technology, and we will only consider air conditioning units as cooling devices. For example, we will neglect the existence of fans, etc. Clearly, when I was mentioning that you can complicate this exercise, you can, for example, add other type of cooling device, like it could be the case for fans. We model the growth of service demand based on one fixed growth parameter. To project the ownership more accurately, we could also integrate information, for example, as Tim said during the presentation, about rate of urbanization and other stuff. So I will move on. Analysis. So step 0 is the analysis of the historical data, because before thinking about the future, we have to have to see a bit what's the what was the past. Just one second. Okay. As I said, I will just go through this very quickly because it's really long and I want you to do it by yourself. And then if you have questions, just feel free to contact me. So the question 1 is: up to today, how have evolved some relevant indicators like GDP per capita, household occupancy, and number of AC units per household? So to do that, if you open the clean Excel file, you will see colored in yellow the cells you need to fill for each specific question. So in this question, you need to fill these cells, which are colored in yellow and which refers to the previous 2 decades. So for close to 2 decades, so from 2000 to 2018, you can calculate that you have clearly the answer in the in this handbook file, but clearly here is just simple calculation. Pay attention again to the unit of measurements, because for example, here you have the GDP per capita in dollars. Here we want to have it in kilo dollars. Once you have calculated these values, which are simple ratios between the values you have above, we would like to make projections of the relevant drivers. For example, you have Tim during the lectures which explained you what are drivers and how we use them. We have, for example, in this case, GDP per capita, which will be our main driver. In this case, first of all, we need to calculate, and again, it's colored in yellow, the GDP per capita in a different unit, as I told you, and then we will try to do the projections in terms of number of AC units per household in the future. To do that, here you have the int. We have different approaches. You can do it using, as we have done in the previous exercise, using a constant growth rate. So you can calculate which was the average growth rate in the previous years, and use that same growth in the future. So you have this here in this first part of the answer, and that's kind of simple approach. You also have the possibility to do a much more robust projection, which is using econometric regression approach. So I I remember from my first lecture that all of you basically said you were using Excel for modeling. So if you can do it, otherwise just write me. You can use the Excel function of the trend line that also gives you the equation for the formula for the curve representing the past trend. So you have A and B, which are parameters for this equation, and you also have the R-square parameter, which is a parameter which tells you how much the regression is close to the actual value. So here we have 0.97, which is close to 1, and we will use that. Another driver we need to assess is how the household occupancy will evolve in the future. In this case, again, you have highlighted which are the cells you are required to fill. In this case, you will try first. I should suggest you to try first with a linear approach, which is the same as above, but you will see that the linear approach isn't the best one, because first, you can already see it, let's say, graphically, because you can see how this line is not following actually what is the trend, the past trend in terms of household occupancy as a function of GDP per capita. You will see also described in the answer how this function is not a linear, but as this kind of yeah, you can try many, because if you see here in the right, there are many options. You will see that the power and the inverse curves are the two curves that are more in line with the data, and you can also see it through the R-square value that you can plot in Excel. You will see, using these parameters and trying to calculate the person per household projection, that the final curve is really fits the available data, and also the R-square is closer to 1 with respect to the linear approach. So the same goes for the number of households. Here, each question is basically asking you to do the projection for all of these drivers. So same, how will the number of AC units evolve in the country? So that you can do it by simply multiplying what you calculated above, which is the average number of AC units per household, and also the population, the projected population, and the number of households which are projected in the future. So here you have, for example, the million of AC units that we will have in the future. Second step is estimating the future demands for energy services. How will energy service demand per equipment evolve in the future? Again, in this case, you can try a linear approach in doing this projection. And same when dealing with the historical and future total energy service demand for residential cooling. So again, I will not go in details on all the calculations, but really it's just for you to go through this document, through the Excel file which has the solutions, and have this and try to replicate what is proposed in this document. Same you can do, again, it's really the same calculation, but with different drivers, and I suggest you to try both with linear and also different curves in order to see which among those is best suited for each question. In this case, you can calculate the historical efficiency levels of these AC units during the historical trend, during the historical period, and then try to project it in the future, again, finding the best approach. And at the end, you will have also to calculate the share of so the final energy demand for residential cooling in the future, and also work on the market share of the different technologies, you will see in the question that different information are given for each technology so that you can model them and try to see in the future what will be their market share in terms of technology allocation in the country. And last, you will have the possibility of doing some sensitivity analysis, as I showed you in the previous lecture, to see how service demand intensity, overall efficiency, and total electricity demand change based on the changing of some of the parameters that we have presented you. So we've been joined by my colleague team, which was the person presenting you the overall methodology you have seen during this lecture. So we will now move to a Q&A session. If you have any doubt, feel free to raise your hand or write your question in the Q&A box. Team and I are here to answer that, answer those questions. Hi, team. Nice to have you with us.
Dylan, thanks very much. Hello, everybody. And I hope you've enjoyed the session and looking forward to many questions that you may have.
In the meantime, yeah, so feel free to, I can see if you raise your hand, so feel free to do it. Again, this exercise is a bit more complicated, let's say, with respect to the one we did for the introduction, but clearly it was an introduction to modeling. So really try to do it by yourself, maybe not necessarily looking at the beginning to the hints and the solution. And if you have doubts, go to first to the hints and then to the solutions. And if even with this you have some questions, you have some doubts, feel free to reach out to me, and then I will see also with the colleagues if there is need to involve them. And also, if you want to complicate a bit the model, feel free to do it, and also to ask us how to do it, and maybe some assumptions that you want to add, other technologies and whatever.
And just to mention the exercises that you've just seen there, they're exactly the type of exercises that we're doing every day in terms of projecting energy demand for different buildings end uses. So it's obviously critical, as you've seen, for us to start with an idea of what is the service demand for a different end use. For example, how many refrigerators does an average household own in Kenya today? And then how do we think that's going to evolve as electrification, urbanization, and incomes evolve in the future? And then looking at what type of refrigerators in terms of their efficiency exist today in people's homes, what's being sold in the market today, and then what's going to be sold in the future and how that might be influenced by different policies. So these are absolutely the questions that we're looking at to help understand future demand. Any questions on the methodology or other elements of this work? I'd love to hear as well how this sort of analysis or methodology could be applied to your work. And yeah.
Okay, I don't see any other question.
Maybe I can ask a question for participants. Are you concerned about, or what is the end use in buildings that most concerns you in terms of potential growth of demand and how that might impact the electricity system, for example? Are you looking at cooling, refrigeration, or other appliances?
To answer, just raise your hand if you want, and I can give you the floor, or if you want, you can write it in the chat or Q&A box.
Maybe another question. Perhaps can you tell me anything about evolutions in cooking access in Kenya? I understand that a lot of households rely on either just fuel wood that they either gather themselves or on charcoal that they're buying in markets. So wondering if there's policies in place to help households shift away from charcoal to either to LPG or to electricity, any electric cooking being taken up. Thanks, Jemima.
Yeah,
Yep.
I don't
So
see
yeah,
any
LPG.
answer.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, I think
Jemima, yeah.
yeah, we see that in many markets, lots of LPG uptake, and obviously much more preferable fuel to cooking with bioenergy in many cases. Obviously, there's the emissions impact as well to consider. Would you be able to tell me if it's cheaper for a household to buy charcoal or to use LPG for cooking? I hope the buildings lecture hasn't put you to sleep. That's good feedback if it has. That means we need to make it more lively and active for next time. We can't hear you, Jemima, no.
1 second, I can try to, okay. Now you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hello.
Okay, now you can
Hello,
we can
yes,
hear
we
you.
can hear you now.
I had asked a question about whether it's cheaper for us to buy LPG, but I guess it depends on whether it's in the urban area or the rural area. So you'd find maybe rural area it's cheaper to use charcoal, but the government has made the uptake of LPG accessible to both rural and urban. And we can see a significant growth even in the rural area. Maybe right now the price of LPG is rising. Maybe because the living standards are also rising. Yeah, I can say we have many debts to pay. And so maybe increase in taxes. Yeah, but there was a project in Kenya where the government, through the National Oil Company, where they were selling the LPG cylinders and gas at subsidized prices, but it has since stalled. But I think it was also a good idea for the uptake. There's significant drop in use of kerosene. I'm not aware if we use coal, but kerosene, significant drop. But you can see there's a COCO network. They have they have projects where they have set up small equipment where you can refill kerosene. But significantly, there was a drop in kerosene usage because also the price of kerosene was almost at the level of diesel when they put the anti-adulteration levy on kerosene. Yeah, to discourage adulteration of fuel. So you find that because of that, the price of kerosene shot up, and people dropped the use of kerosene. Solid biomass, not very sure. Yes. Also charcoal, I think we have discouraged cutting down of trees. Also, we've seen a significant drop in usage of charcoal over time.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jemima. That's really interesting information. And yeah, I think we've followed a little bit what's happening in Kenya, and especially on the LPG front and subsidies there. So yeah, very interesting to hear those developments.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Jemima. Okay, so I think I don't see any other question. So I would close here the session. Thank you very much, team, for being with us, and also for the work in creating the presentation and presenting them. So for the attendance, we see each other next Tuesday when we will deal with the power sector. And yeah, I invite you to try to do both the exercise we worked on today and also the next one. And if you have doubts, don't hesitate to write me and ask me for clarification. So have a nice Thursday, Friday, and also weekend, and see you next week. Bye. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Darlene. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.